Welcome everyone to ICSS Sunday Morning Marxist Forum. My name is Alan Miller and I'm a member of the program committee for ICSS Sunday Morning Sessions. We're based in Oakland, California in the San Francisco Bay Area, USA. Our weekly programs are online via Zoom every Sunday morning at 10:30 a.m. Pacific Time. You can sign up at our website, icssmarks.org, to receive weekly email announcements for our Sunday sessions. You can also view videos of past presentations and send us a message using our contact form on our website, which is again icssmarks.org. We want to call your attention to the coffee cup icon on our homepage and our donation page, where you can make a donation to support our programs. Excuse me. Our program today is on the history and lessons from the Filipino immigrant farm workers struggle, a history that is too often left out of narratives on the U.S. farm workers' struggles. Our speaker is Mary Jane Galviso, is a veteran farm worker, organizer, and activist, a member of the Filipino Farmers Cooperative in the California Central Valley, who was born and raised in the California Imperial Valley. She will talk about the lessons for the left resulting from the fierce struggle between Filipino agricultural workers and agribusiness capitalists. We'll start as usual with a presentation, and after a short break for announcements, we'll have a group discussion where you can express your views on the subject and ask questions. So with that, I want to welcome Mary Jane. A warm welcome to our session this morning, and we're really excited to have you speaking. Thank you so much. Go ahead.
Thank you for having me. I know, Alan, you'd asked me for a little bit of a bio, and I just get so overwhelmed with the work here. I have, you know, I'm a member of the Filipino Farmers Cooperative here in Orosi, Northern Tulare County, and we are the last remaining Filipino farming community in the United States. We're the only actually or nonprofit that actually focus on building and creating farmer and worker cooperatives in rural communities. So just very, very briefly, I was just reading the text from some allies, and in Delano yesterday, they commemorated a very the 1965 grape strike. You may have seen it online. They titled it "A Bold Move," and what's interesting is that, of course, they do understand that I come from the left, that I am a communist, and I'm openly a communist. And so they're inviting me, and we go back and forth about this. They're inviting me to the Larry Itliong, because this is how they've reduced class struggle to Itliong and Philip Veracruz, right? And they're saying, we will invite FONS, which is the Filipino American National Historical Society. We will probably be more productive if we could do away with the disagreements in front of the public, who will benefit more if we educate rather than criticize each other. In other words, let's not have class struggle. Okay. Let's not debate the issues. And this is where I think my voice is instrumental. I'll tell you one thing. I can say that I am walking, talking history. I am first source history. So when you talk about the grape strikes, although I was still a teenager, I was very cognizant in my family. We were very much of that history. I was raised and grew up on a farm in Imperial County. If anybody knows Imperial County, anyone? No? Imperial Valley. There was a lot of class struggle within the agricultural struggle sector in Imperial County, and so as a teenager, we had our farm, but in the summer months, all the family, we took to picking grapes. We went up to Coachella Valley, and in those days, whether you were of the age to work or not, the big growers coming from the Central Valley, the Fresno, Bakersfield area, I mean, they hired us as, as crews. And and if you know anything about agriculture in this country, the workforce is very, very racially stratified, rigidly stratified. So we were all Filipino crews in those days. And the Baracero Act had just basically been ended, and so the Mexicans were basically beginning to organize as their crews, mainly coming out of Mexicali. And so anyway, I was there when the Coachella grape strike was called for. And of course, we were victorious. We won that strike. And, uh, and so that was in May. And so that's where the Great Harvest starts, actually, in Coachella Valley, and ends in Delano, in and around Delano, in September. But by the time that the harvest moved up to the grape strike, the big growers were ready, prepared for us to strike. And but they took a tact that we were completely unprepared for. And this is what I really speak to. And I think I'm the only person on this planet that speaks to it very openly and the like. And that is how the US capitalists, how the bourgeoisie really, through the Chavez faction, hijacked the class struggle and the trade union organizing within the agricultural sector in this country. It was planned. It's not like, oh, it just happened. It was, so when I talk about the Chavez faction, okay, and, you know, uh, I think that many of you know who they are, right? Gil Padilla, he's still alive. He lives up here in Fresno. He doesn't speak. He doesn't speak much at all, actually. I've talked to him, and he just won't go public. You know what I'm saying? He's had his disagreements. He's not going to go public. You have Dolores Huerta, who hates my guts, and every time she sees me in the crowd, she calls security. I mean, she wants me out. And you have Eliseo Medina, who has risen the ranks, and through the SEIU became one of the, you know, to lead one of the biggest trade unions in the United States, and others. But what is telling is how the Chavez image and the whole movement around him was created. And if you read these books, I don't know, how many have you read Bernanke's book, Trampling Out the Vintage? None? None? Okay. How many of you have read this book, From the Jaws of Victory, The Triumph and Tragedy of Cesar Chavez and the Farm Worker Movement? I'll say one thing. They are very, very, as you know, Bernanke was very detailed. I mean, it was a very thick book. It was a very, full of data, full of, the events and how things unfolded. And then his book, and Matt Garcia, and he's a professor out of University of Arizona. But I'll tell you, when you read these books, and that's why it's very important that I one day, someday, write the book that really that is meaningful. And what I mean meaningful is this: that both Bernanke and Garcia, what they do is they talk about people. They make the central theme Chavez, right? That's the central theme. Well, that's not the Marxist view of history, is it? No, certainly not. I mean, when we read the Communist Manifesto, we understand that history is made by the masses engaged in class struggle and class warfare. And neither books speaks to the economic conditions that gave rise to the class struggle within the agricultural sector within the United States. So let me just very briefly give you an overview. What did 1898 mean to us in the United States? Anyone have an, an idea? 1898. Anyone? No? 1898 is when the United States formally joined the imperialist nations of Europe to become an imperialist power. In that year, in 1898, it was very active. It seized Cuba, it seized Puerto Rico, it seized Guam, and landed its troops on Waikiki and took Iolani Palace and kept Princess Liliuokalani under house arrest for 7 years. And it steamed forward towards the Philippines and seized the Philippines. So with those 5 colonies, the United States was able to join the ranks of the imperialist powers. And so it was able to because Spain, of course, I mean, there were outright revolutions in Cuba and Puerto Rico and the Philippines. I mean, Spain was could not hold on, just simply could not hold on to its colonial territory, colonial lands. And who was waiting in the wings, of course, was the United States. Britain could not hold on to Hawaii. And they did try a little. Britain did try a little in the Philippines, but it couldn't. The United States was the emerging capitalist power, and it was to go in. So it in what do you say, backroom negotiations and in drama in Cuba and the United States, it had these mock battles between the U.S. ships and Spanish forces, in which the Spanish, seceded, and said, "Hey, you won fair and clear, fair and square, and we're sailing off into the horizon. In the U.S., you're, take it over." And that's basically what it did. But in both Cuba and in the Philippines, particularly, that was a very, very long, bloody war. It's never represented in this country in textbooks, but to this day, it's never been clearly documented how many people were murdered, were killed. And when I say murdered, we're talking civilians, okay? Just like what's happening now in many parts of the world, is that the civilian population is not spared. And in the Philippines, I mean, mass graves were found for decades and decades afterwards. This is where the United States began to go into learning or utilizing torture methods, utilizing the indigenous people, the mountain tribes people, against the general population. I mean, this is where the United States, honed its tactics and its strategies, right, in military warfare. But the saying by, forgive me, I don't keep names in my head very well, but, the general that was leading the forces in the Philippines made it very clear, you're going to kill everyone over 7 years old in those regions that were considered, totally and completely enemy. And there were many areas of resistance in the central, particularly in the central and the northern part of the Philippines. It was just fierce fighting. In the South, if you know anything about the Philippines, the South is Muslim. The population is Muslim, and they very much are much closer, actually, to the northern part, the other parts of the Philippines. They're much more closer to Indonesia, to Brunei, to all, to the other Muslim nations there in Southeast Asia. So they were not as involved in the Philippine Revolution against Spain and against the United States. But of course, the outcome was it was a very brutal war, and in the end, the United States crushed the revolutionary forces for independence and moved in and took many years. But here's the big distinction that many Marxists do not make. The Spanish type of colonialism was what I term smash and grab, right? They went in there, they smashed what they could, and they grabbed whatever resources. They enslaved, as much as they could. Spanish ships were actually slave ships, right? And the first Filipinos that came to the US were actually used by the Spanish to just drop off, like in the Gulf of Mexico and on the West Coast, to test the waters. Were the natives friendly? In the Gulf, they were friendly, and those that those that were set on land and actually jumped ship. A lot of them jumped ship. A lot of Filipinos jumped ship off the Spanish galleons. They stayed and they intermarried and they formed their own communities on the West Coast. They were not so friendly, and the first Filipinos that were put on shore, of course, were killed. But I say that because this is very interesting how U.S. imperialism has become such a power, because Spain was not interested outside of like I said, extraction, just extracting whatever natural resources, whatever they could take out of, and whether it's Cuba, Puerto Rico, that's all they were doing. The United States came in a very different way. They wanted to completely uh, integrate the colonies into the U.S. economic system. And so what they did, of course, once is that in Manila, being the center, they established the colonial government, and very in a very intelligent way. They realized that it's not going to be easy going holding on to colonies and keeping off other imperialist powers like Japan and others trying to get in, right? So they created a colonial government that set up the educational system that would supply the United States with what we have today, right? If you're going to engage in warfare, right, you need military, right? And any Filipino today can join the U.S. forces, and once their term ends, can apply and become a U.S. citizen. And that's why you see a lot of Filipinos. They've come in through the U.S. military. The other way, of course, are the so-called professional jobs, medical, right? You need a lot of medical. You need a large medical workforce if you're engaging in warfare, right? And so that's why, and even now, right? You see, I don't know if there's any clinic or hospital in the United States that doesn't have a Filipino on staff. It's just part of the health system. And then, of course, attorneys to ensure that the legal system of the United States was enforced and it would become the law of the land in the colonies in the Philippines. And then, of course, the education. So that's why you have so many call centers in the Philippines, because the United States made it a requirement that Filipinos had to speak English, and in fact banned the national language. How bizarre, right? You ban the national language and you make English the language. So, but that is where this begins to intersect, because by the 1920s, well, actually after World War I, the United States was looking to these colonies for cheap, very cheap labor, right? And so in Puerto Rico and in the Philippines, its peoples were beginning to be exported and Filipinos and Puerto Ricanos came together on the plantations in Hawaii. And the plantations in Hawaii, of course, were controlled by what they considered the Big Five. It was a monopoly. They controlled every single island, and the islands were just the landscape became plantations, pineapple and sugar plantations. And as a U.S. territory, they call them a U.S. territory. It doesn't really make any difference. I mean, it was colonialized completely. Um, but but the United States and the sugar and agricultural, they noted something very uh, particular about Filipinos, and that was that they had as Filipinos, I mean, we have a very collective sense. We have a very deep sense of community. If you've ever worked with any Filipinos, you will notice that immediately they will begin to organize, parties and get-togethers. I mean, that's just part of our national psyche. Our and and the U.S. capitalists recognize that. I mean, they recognize it among African Americans too, working on the plantations. The plantation economy led to that. Working in gangs, working, in harmony. It was not true with the Hawaiians. It wasn't true with the Portuguese. It wasn't true with the other peoples that came to Hawaii. But it was very, very true among Filipinos. So by the 1930s, of course, the independence movement in the Philippines continued to rage on. It did. And the United States said, okay, it announced, we're going to give you nominal independence. We're going to give you independence. Okay. You got to stop all this fighting against us. We're going to give you independence, but all your people in Hawaii have to leave. Have to leave. So my aunties and my older great aunt, she was, they described that time to me, and they said, everybody in the plantations. We were in Maui, and my uncles were on the Big Island. They were told, if you're old, if you're a child, a minor, and if you're a woman, you must go back to the Philippines. That's the condition if the Philippines wants independence. So of course they turned it the Repatriation Act. It was, and and I mean, let's make it clear, it was a mass deportation. You got on the ship and you went back to the Philippines, because who the United States wanted on the West Coast and in Alaska and in Southwest were young, able-bodied, unattached males, unmarried males. That's who they wanted in the workforce. So my family, of course, that there was no immigration between. So part of that condition, of course, was the United States cut off immigration from the Philippines to the United States throughout the 40s, 50s, and up until the 60s. And so we were divided families. We were separated families for decades. And I think that the quota that the United States gave was only 5 Filipinos per year from the Philippines to the United States. But anyway, that gave the United States time, you see, to completely indoctrinate and create that colonial mentality among the Filipino populace. The United States needed that time and said, okay, we'll just leave you be. And that was a very, very smart, strategic move by the United States. Anyone understand why? I studied that. I studied that quite a bit, because one time I made a presentation and we talked about what were all the different uprisings and rebellions and insurrections within the Philippines. Oh boy, in any part of the Philippines, it was happening. Even when Spain pulled out, I mean, it was happening. It was insurrection after rebellion. I mean, you couldn't keep the people down, especially the peasantry. The poverty was so deep. And so anyway, the United States used the importation of Filipino labor as a, what do they call it? Like a valve, a release valve, right? Okay, you're not going to make it in the Philippines. Hey, get on the ship, right? And come to the US. Come to the US. And so that is what uh and I mean, in terms of insurrections, you're always looking for the young men, right? They're the ones that are going to be uh, the real revolutionaries and troublemakers in many parts. And so they were the ones that the United States and the sugar and the agricultural companies targeted to, to board in Manila Bay and make it to the plantations of Hawaii. And then, like I said, in beginning in the 20s and 30s, it was the pivot. Agriculture, U.S. agriculture needed, wanted labor. I shouldn't say needed because there was a lot of labor. It needed cheaper labor in the West Coast, and of course, they really wanted to open up in a big way the seafood industry in Alaska. And so those were the two target points, and boatloads and boatloads. Seattle and Los Angeles, San Francisco were big ports of entry for Filipino men. And I'm talking men. Okay. There were no women on those ships. So, so if you look at the early Filipino communities, right, they were almost all, I would say 99% male. They were, so, but anyway, the interesting thing is that Filipinos intermarry everywhere or anywhere, and so you'll see large communities. In fact, my own hometown is very reflective of that time. So, at the time that Filipinos were brought in, I believe 5 of the Western states, right, had passed laws, and these were really, I mean, if you want to know uh, about some really racist laws, they applied to to Filipinos. They did apply in various ways to like other Asians, but not in the way that it did to Filipinos. So Filipinos could never ever, okay, you're a colonial, you came in as a ward of state. A ward of the state, did you know that term? A ward of state, you know what a ward of a state is, right? You're either an orphan, you're a convict, you don't make decisions. The government makes it, or the court makes the decision for you. Well, that's the status in which Filipinos came in. We were wards of the state. In other words, you didn't say, you were colonized, and now you were wards of the state. Okay. And we would make the decisions for you. So Filipinos could not buy land, could not vote, could not become a U.S. citizen, could not intermarry, could not buy a business. I mean, there was a long line of do not, cannot, will, And so basically, what that served to do was politically alienate Filipinos from right from the political system, and then also socially ostracize Filipinos, right, from the general population, keep us as a very separate population. And so, like I said, U.S. capitalism was very clever. What they wanted to create was what I term a mobile workforce. You wanted young men that, hell, you didn't have to stay because your wife wants you to stay and you got kids. No, no, no. You have no wife and no kids. If you want, we want you to pick apples in Yakima in Washington. All the Filipino crews get up there. If we want you picking lettuce up down in the Arizona California border down near Yuma, El Centro, all the crews get down there. If we want you in Watsonville and Salinas, right? Or if we want you in Stockton for the asparagus, if we want you in the Sacramento Delta. So there were crews, Filipino crews, up and down the West Coast through the Southwest, throughout the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. And what's interesting about that movement is that, as I said, it was a double sword for the U.S. capitalists. while Filipinos uh, were very adept at working in cooperative work style. I mean, there was, you can pick up. I mean, we worked together as crews, and we were very devoted to agriculture. This is the other thing. We're very devoted, despite the exploitative conditions and the oppressive situations. We were renowned for how, for those places that we planted and cared for and picked and packed fruits and vegetables. We were renowned, right? Uh, One reason why the United States doesn't grow white asparagus anymore is because they lost that skill with Filipino labor. We honed that skill in this country. But anyway, those crews that went up and down, and as when I was growing up, I mean, my brothers, my uncles, they were all part of those crews during the months we weren't working on the farm. So I got to know a lot about that whole extensive network of Filipino labor camps. I got to know about all the Filipino halls, and that was the other thing, that we really stand out as a people, that every single place we settled, there would be a Filipino hall. LA, Stockton, San Francisco. San Francisco had like 5 or 6 Filipino halls, right? I mean, everywhere. And we understood as children, everywhere you go, you're not sure what to do, you go to the Filipino hall, you tell them who you're from. You just say our town, you tell them what village we came from in the Philippines. And there you would be fed, there you would be taken care of, right? So, and that, unfortunately, that, it just pains me, but that has been lost. I think almost all the community halls have been lost. Um, they have been. Um, it's a very sad thing. But anyway, that is the tradition in which I grew up, because that social ostracism that the US pushed on Filipinos really, like I said, it was the double sword. They built such strong. Hey, hey, ooh, hey, hey. Whoa, whoa, no, no, fight, fight. No. I'm sorry. I was expecting my sisters, and all the small dogs have come to the house. We don't leave them on the farm. But anyway, so was this very strong sense of community, and that strong sense of community let uh, 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 was fertile ground for trade union organizing. And oh yeah, so many of the red unions, well, let me just say, not only did the Filipinos join trade unions in large numbers, I mean, we also joined the Communist Party USA in large numbers, right? We got our training. The ILW, as you know, was a red union, and it was where many Filipinos, in fact, the ILW for many decades has been our union. They were the first to recruit us as union members on the Hawaii plantations, in Alaska, and throughout the West Coast. They helped and train a Filipino labor leadership that was Marxist, that was very class, just steeped in class struggle, understood that. And so the 1920s, Filipinos, we were imported really to, just like Mexican labor today, was to undermine the any wage increases, right? So and if you read during the 20s and 30s and into the 40s, there were a number of anti-Filipino riots, because they bring Filipino crews into town, and they'd pay us 5 cents, and they'd pay the white workers 10 cents. Well, they'd let all the white workers go, right? And keep on the Filipinos for, half the price. So in Salinas, that was a huge one. And of course, people were killed there. Here where I am in Tulare County, that was one of the worst riots, in which they're saying like 300 white men, right, basically chased the Filipinos out of the area with shotguns. And when I say I'm firsthand knowledge, I know that because my father was experienced that. He was so traumatized, and I'm traumatized by that pain, that he could never say the name of where it took place. He couldn't say it. And so it was up to us to kind of figure out where did it take place. But let me just tell you, the scars were so deep that from that point on, actually, my father had severe bouts of mental crisis, was in and out of the state hospitals. It was just very, well, in those days, I mean, they didn't treat racism, but anyway, he eventually did commit suicide. It just gets to the point where those haunting images don't go away. And so anyway, as I said, Filipinos are very sociable, a very sociable people. If you know any Filipinos, we're very sociable. We like to join. And did we join? We joined, like I said, the CPUSA. We joined the trade unions in large numbers and rose to the leadership. In many, the Canneries Union, the ILW, especially on the plantations in Hawaii, we were, and it really irks me that they only talk about the Japanese, but the Filipinos were some of the finest union organizers on the plantations, were blacklisted, were driven out. Some of them had to make their way out, because once you're banned from plantation, you're never getting back in, and made their way to the West Coast. But I start there because this is the real essence of what I talk about, and that is what became of the. I mean, we're looking at decades and decades of real intense class struggle within the U.S. agricultural sector, right? Of a drive for unionization, and what happened. The academics, and they'll all say, "Oh, it was because of let me." It was because domestic workers and so-called farm workers were not allowed to, not allowed to join unions, right? How many of you know that? You know that law? Okay. So as you know, it was done under the National Labor Relations Act when that was started, that the U.S. banned in 1935 that they could not. All of the industrialized workers, of course, they had the right to collective bargaining rights. They could unionize, but labor, agricultural labor, and domestic labor were excluded. And nevertheless, Filipinos continue to agitate, to organize, and to form, to be part of unions, right? And even though we formed our own unions, we were very closely aligned with the other red unions. So when you think about all this history, I mean, you look at after World War, I mean, some of the biggest strikes, the asparagus strike up in, that was Filipino led. That was, wow, that was a huge strike. The strike in 47, if any of you knew Howard Keeler, Howard Keeler, of course, was already a member of the CPUSA at that time, and that's when he began to really begin to know the members of the Filipino labor leadership. They were all communists, and so they had a great time organizing that strike. I mean, there were more than 7,000 Filipino workers that walked out for that strike. It was the first strike after World War II, when the ban on it helped to break the ban on the no strike agreement with the U.S. government after the war. And, I think that Filipinos were very militant and just led the way. Let's end this. We're going on strike. And they did. And so all through that period, strike after strike. And when I talk to them about that, it's painful to hear, because aside from the Coachella grape strike, right, most of those strikes ended in utter defeat. Capitalism within the agricultural sector were very powerful force and remain powerful. As you know, they're probably the richest lobbyists. Maybe the tech people have overcome it, but they're the richest lobbyists in Sacramento, in Washington. They're very powerful, extremely wealthy, with lots of resources, and that's where the story really begins, right? So when you look at these books, right, and they only focus on Chavez, right? It got me thinking, well, wait a minute. Chavez, right? Chavez, who never worked in the fields in his life. Never worked in the fields in his life. He may have as a kid, but as an adult, he never, ever did. Dolores Huerta, she was a public school teacher from New Mexico. Never, ever worked in the fields. Okay. And I'm saying, like, how the hell did they become the face of farm labor in this country? How the hell did that happen? And that's where the left, where we have to really delve in and understand what the bourgeoisie did. What did the bourgeoisie do? The bourgeoisie, right? I mean, Black folks were giving the bourgeoisie a hard time during the 60s and 70s, all that urban uprisings and the insurrections, man. I mean, they were, but they had one thing, and that was Martin Luther King. And he was all about nonviolence and placating and let's calm down and like that. Well, of course, Martin Luther King changed at the end. I think Malcolm X had much more influence, right, among the young, among those who were more class conscious, right, than Martin Luther King. But Martin Luther King is who the corporate media promoted. They promoted him as the face of the Black liberation movement. Well, the bourgeoisie needed the same thing in the country, in the rural, in the agricultural sector. And it certainly wasn't going to be Filipinos. Hell no. No. They were not going to be Filipinos. They're communists, they're militants, they're all about fighting, fighting the capitalists. We can't have them. We can't have them, right? And so lo and behold, like I said, by September 65, when the harvest had come up after we had won the strike in Coachella, all the Filipino crews, we had all been fired through Coachella. And, I missed that point about, that was my first taste about how the big growers treated, and it's interesting because, people, even Howard asked me, well, did Larry, tell you this, Larry Leon, did he tell you this, or did he share this with you? Did it, Howard, he didn't have to tell me. I grew up in that experience. He didn't have to tell me he was a communist. I mean, you don't think that somewhere along the line that, you just know where you stand, right? And Filipino crews, by the 60s, they knew that we were an older people. They wanted the young men coming in from Mexico now. They were going to replace us, just like we were, like we replaced uh the rest. Because remember, in the 20s and 30s, the United States was really pushing out the white people, really pushing white people out of the agricultural sector. No, we don't need them picking cotton anymore. We don't need them, and the black folks, we want them in the cities. We want them working in the factories. Get them white people out. Like, if you come here to my farm, to the farm town I'm in right now, white flight is pretty much complete. You're not going to see any white people around here. It's all brown people now, right? And that's pretty much what white flight has done. So, uh, but that was the time in the 20s and 30s, the United States. And then, of course, the war really accelerated the movement of white and black folks out of the rural areas in the U.S.
Mary Jane, we want to leave time for questions and answers.
Questions. Okay. So
This is
let
gonna
me
be great.
just,
So go ahead and wrap up, and we'll take a break. But let's.
okay.
This is really great. Go ahead.
So, so like I said, by the 60s, the Filipino labor, work crews were aging. We were now in our 60s, 70s. My uncle was already, I know he was 65, but, and so young kids, we were brought in. So they needed someone else. And so on September 5th, when the strike vote was taken, and the strike vote again was taken in the Filipino Hall in Delano. No, there's no historical plaque there because the UFW blocks it. But anyway, the strike was called for, and the Filipino crews walked out. And but we always had that problem, scabs. And so the Filipino labor leadership, Velasquez, Idleong, and the others, they said, well, who represents the Mexicans around here? We got to talk to them. I mean, they're not in the unions, they're not organizing. And where can we? So they went to the nearby church. They went to the church. Bad mistake. Anyway, and that's where they found Chavez. Chavez, as you know, was a long, long, long time. And I think that was his only employer, right? Was the Catholic Church. He was part of the Catholic Social Services Organization, CSO or whatever. So he rebuffed us 3 times. No, we're not going on strike. No, we'll agree. No, we're going to work. Yeah. In other words, we're going to scab. We're going to go across your picket lines. So of course, this has been a familiar situation with Filipinos down the decades. So they told Chavez, wait a minute, Chavez, why don't we do this? Let the workers decide. Can you just let's have a big meeting here in the church and let the workers decide. Well, what do you think the workers decided? Yeah, we're going on strike. Hell, they treat us like crap, just like they treat the Filipinos, right? So they joined our strike. They joined the strike. And that's how Chavez came into the picture. But like I said, the leadership was still very much Filipino until Chavez entered the Filipino Hall. And it was interesting because who his main advisors was, of course, the Catholic Church. They were always the power behind him, advising him and telling him. So, of course, he was always about class collaboration. The Catholic Church wanted to make sure no more strikes because you don't want to hurt our big donors, those big Italian grape growers. You don't want to hurt, these are no more strikes now. Chavez, can you do that? Can you do that? Okay, well, it was harder than he thought to end that strike. But anyway, like they say, the train left the station, but they were going to derail that train. And that was really what the true legacy of the UFW is today.
Let's go ahead and pause there. A few
Okay.
short announcements. and then we're going to have questions. We can get more into this during the Q&A. If you want to grab a glass of water, let me go ahead and make a few announcements. After a few announcements, we are going to have questions and comments from participants. To ask a question or make a comment, please raise your hand by clicking on the reactions button, raise hand at the bottom of your Zoom window. We want to remind everyone to please keep your questions short on the topic at hand. Ask one question at a time to allow everyone to participate. Also, keep in mind that this is a comradely forum for political discussion. Please show respect to other participants and the moderator of today's sessions. Next week, on September 14th at 10:30 a.m. Pacific time, we're going to have a special program, Why Did the USSR Collapse? And speaking will be researcher, historian, and author Professor Grover Furr, a regular speaker at our Sunday morning sessions, whose present research is on the Gorbachev period, which culminated in the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. We also want to remind you that you can sign up for email notifications for our programs at ICSSmarks.org. That's ICSSmarks.org, where you can find links to video recordings of our past programs. You can contact us with feedbacks and suggestions for future programs and topics, and make a donation to support our Sunday morning programs. So with that, what we're going to do is we're going to start taking questions. And as soon as Mary Jane gets back in the studio.
No, I'm here.
You're here. Okay.
Yeah, I was
Okay.
just
All
trying
right.
to fill up my cup.
Why don't we start with Sheila first? So Sheila, if you would unmute and ask your question, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. I apologize, I was late, but your talk was just amazing, and I just did. It was such an eye opener. I had no idea of what the history that you told us. I really appreciate it. And are you by any chance working on a book?
I
Because
should.
yes, you must.
If I can find the time.
You absolutely must write a book. This is a precious history, and it's got to be told. It's just amazing. Thank you.
Okay. Next will be Norma. If you would unmute, please.
Yeah, hi.
Go ahead.
Hi. Alan, I'm sorry I'm not coming out with a question immediately. True to form. Mary Jane, that was fine. That was so fine. And as Sheila said, and a lot of us will say, stuff we didn't know. I posted a note in the chat about the abuse of labor, animals. I got a piece of mail yesterday from somebody describing the life of chickens, caged chickens, and looking it up, it gave on to farming chickens and eggs before the capitalist brutality. And we have to keep notice, because if we want to eat meat, we have to treat it nicely. And it's very possible. You've probably seen these programs that what's her name? I forget her name right now, that talks about not abusing livestock. But that's part of life, is for us. It has been the brutalization of the land we live on, the involvement with all of us. And, you know, when I tell people that we are slaves, they go, oh, I'm not a slave. Yes, you are. You are a slave to the owning class that makes profit off of your existence, off of your labor, off of your abuse. I'm sure that you have a lot to say that agrees with what I'm talking about, and some of it terribly happened to your
Let's
people.
let her let's give her a chance to to
Yeah,
respond.
to
And then we'll have
happen
Raj. Go ahead.
as it happened to your people.
Yeah.
Yes.
Go ahead. Mary J, if you want to make
Real quickly,
a comment. Yeah.
we we've had several invitations. We primarily focus on Filipino student clubs, community organizations, and we invite them to come up here to see us. I mean, we're traditional Filipino farmers. But one thing that we make clear is that we practice good life and good death among all our animals. Good life, good death. And but one thing that we do is that we organize tours. I mean, we organize tours of the Filipino farms here, but we also organize tours so people can see where their food comes. This is a cattle lot, right? This is a dairy. Do you see the conditions in which these animals are kept? Do you see the little tiny cages? Well, those are calves with their hind legs that have been amputated, and they're stuffed in these boxes so veal can be produced. So I think it's a learning experience for many people. But what people don't realize, and even people living in this place, I get so, like, wow, you don't know that Tulare, Fresno, and Kern County produce nearly half of this country's food commodities. And I'm talking fruits, vegetables, nuts. And Tulare County today is the top dairy producer in this nation. Do you know how many millions of cattle that means? That means a lot. That means that methane gas is produced at such high levels that many of my relatives have had to move because, I mean, this is considered among the worst air quality in the nation here. But I mean, that's what it means. But I mean, let's be clear: capitalism is not nice to anyone, to any living creature, including this planet. And that is why we should be in the forefront of any movement that exposes the cruelty and that capitalism inflicts uh, on the planet and every living creature. We should be part of this.
Okay, Raj, followed by Mary Gao. So, Raj, please go
Yeah,
ahead.
Mary Jane, thank you very much. I know you for some time now,
Yes.
and you made a very good presentation. I learned a lot. I mean, farm workers were also brought from India. They came to Hawaii, later on came to California. They settled in Central Valley, Fresno area. They have was one of the centers. Similar story, but eventually some of them ended up owning land and became rich. I suppose it's a similar thing in the Filipino community that they became farm owners, small, medium-sized farm owners. So how did that development take place in the Filipino community is something I would like to know. And so there are farm workers, and then there are owners, small business owners. And how do you propose this movement can be integrated with the workers' movement against capitalism? So those are my two questions.
In the first question, I think it's very important to understand the status of a people reflect the status of its nation, of its country. Okay. For Indians, you didn't come as a colonial people. It's very, for Filipinos, we did come, and therefore, in Imperial Valley, there's actually, and all the Indian farmers, they were always called Hindus. That was the name everybody called them. They're the Hindus, and we would go visit them sometimes, and they had these beautiful peacocks. Wow, beautiful peacocks. But anyway, here in the Fresno area, there are some very wealthy, very big, and I don't know why they refer to themselves as Sikhs, the Sikh farmers, right? and they're very how do you say, influential, actually, also through Fresno State University. They're very much part of, they have a very uh, um, a big base within the agricultural departments here. I've met a number of them, and they're very generous. They want to work with us and the like. But that's what I have to say. In terms of Filipino farmers, if you can believe it or not, I am the biggest in terms of land acreage, and it's only 20 acres. I'm the biggest Filipino farmer around. All the others have 2, 3, maybe 5 acres. But again, it reflects that we are a colonialized people, and we don't have the resources that other, you look at the Chinese. The Chinese buy a lot of land, warehouse a lot of land. We just don't have the resources that those people who come from other capitalist nations and other independent countries have. That's a very important distinction to make. And secondly, let me say this clear, and I should have said it earlier. Filipinos, we never used the term farm worker. No. That was Chavez's term because he wanted to only focus on Mexicans who worked in the fields, right? That was his primary focus. In organizing, in trade union organizing, you want to organize the complete chain, right? Whether it's in the fields, in the packing shed, on the loading docks, everywhere, up and down the food chain, you wanted to organize all. So if there's a strike, it gets shut down, all shut down. Well, that of course is what red unionizing was about. And so what we have here today, the Filipinos came out of what the AFL-CIO helped to create, and that was the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee, AWOC. And it was AWOC actually who had called for the 65 grape strikes both in Coachella and Delano. And yet, as I tell many people, the Chavez faction robbed our history. They robbed our history by taking claim for an event that they were not even present at. And I challenge them. Was Chavez there when the strike? Was Chavez there when we went out on strike? Was Huerta there? No, Huerta was not there. They had never, ever, ever entered the Filipino Hall. So how could they have become into that situation? So when I say agricultural workers, and that's the correct term, and why is it correct term? Because one of the significant roles that Filipino colonial labor played was that it helped to industrialize the U.S. agricultural sector. At the time that Filipinos came, it was simple farming. It was still simple farming. You worked for Farmer John down the road, and you worked on his farm. Well, no, the U.S. during that time was really going to turn it into a thoroughly capitalist mode of production, and that's where Filipino workforce was instrumental. It helped. But you know that that class struggle that rose out of that contradiction as the U.S. capitalists pushed to industrialize the agriculture center. Well, it educated the workers to the true nature of capitalism, and that's what produced that real. It produced a very class conscious, segment, and that's what I talk about. The Filipino labor leadership was actually the vanguard in the class struggle within the U.S. agricultural sector, starting in the 20s up into the 60s.
Good. Actually, we have a lot of hands up. We want to try and get everybody's questions. It's Mary Gao. If you would go ahead and unmute, please, and ask your question, Mary.
Hi, Mary Jane. Thank you so much for your presentation. This is very important history that people don't know about. And I'm sorry you couldn't have more time to talk about more recent stuff. But I would like you to talk about what happened during when Marcos had declared martial law in the Philippines. And Chavez, I think at the invitation of Robert Kennedy, went to the Philippines and basically, I think, probably helped lead to the breaking up of the union between the Filipino and Mexican farm workers, or agricultural workers.
I don't know if the Kennedy family was involved in that. I mean, they did have their difficulties with the Marcos regime as well. You know, the Catholic Church was really not doing so well under Marcos. But anyway, one thing is, and this is where I tell Gil Padilla, you know the truth and you're not speaking the truth. I think at that point, really, Chavez was beginning to lose it. And by lose it, you know, he did die. He was probably in a later stage of dementia. And that is why they kept him secluded up in La Paz. Is because and you know, if you guys want to talk to Gil, I mean, he will confirm. I mean, you know, Chavez was certifiably, you know, mentally ill. You know, Al Robles, who we became close friends. He was part of the faction, and he broke after the Filipino leadership and Filipinos were pretty much iced out of the UFW. You know, he told me, I asked him, when's the last time you saw Chavez? He said, well, I went up to La Paz and, you know, Mary Jane. I said, hey, Cesar, it's me, Al. And he always walked around with those big white dogs. They were his constant companions. You know, he said, Chavez looked at me and he started pounding his chest and saying, I'm Cesar, I'm Cesar. And Al said, you know, I was so blown away. I didn't know what to do. And I said, well, did you talk to his family? Why isn't he getting any why wasn't he getting any medical attention? No, the family was never say anything. They would never tell anybody. That's why they just kept him there. And only certain people could see him. I said, oh my gosh, you guys, you know the truth and you're not saying it. You know, there's a reason why they moved the movement, right? First, they move it out of Delano. What the hell are you doing? Moving the headquarters, you know, the workers' headquarters out of Delano, right? You move it out of town near the town dump, right? Because you got some land over there. And then you move it way, way out to the mountains where, yeah, if you're trying to, you know, the workers are supposed to travel, what, 40 miles up into the mountains to see the leadership of their so-called union? What is that about? You know what it was about. It was about making him a martyr, you know, wrapping the whole movement around him and not making it about the workers anymore. That's what it was about. And you know that. And you should speak to it. But you know, I have no idea. Even Huerta will not speak to it. Padilla will not speak. Eliseo will not speak. They will not ever say it.
Okay, next up is Margot, followed by Alazar. So Margot, if you would unmute, please. There you go.
Thank you very much. This was very interesting. But I wanted to tell you that I was living in Salinas in 1951, and Fred Ross and Saul Alinsky came to Salinas to see if they could organize farm workers there. And they decided that Salinas was not a suitable place, and they went to Delano. And Fred Ross and Saul Alinsky had a lot to do with the choice of Chavez as the farm worker leader. And we went to dinner with them and everything and talked about it at the time. And a lot of it came out of the CSU movement in Los Angeles. You know, it's all part of the history, and I thought you might want to add that into it somehow. But thank you for doing this. It was really, really, I learned a lot. Thank you very much.
I should. And, you know, when they talk about Saul Alinsky, if you look at his inner circle, Chavez, it was all white, and it was all Solinsky people. You know, it was all. He later, if I mean, he tried to change that later, but that's what it was. But the big thing is Solinsky was put up to oppose union organizing, right? He coined that term community organizing, right? Community, which was classless. Okay, we're all a community, and you know, we're not going to have any class struggle within this community. And that's what diverted and undermined a lot of the class struggle, right? The workers' class struggle. And so the Catholic Church promoted that, and that's the mode of organizing among Catholic, within the Catholic, you know, social justice movement, is the Solinsky model, right? As opposed to militant trade unionizing and class struggle. So, I mean, there should be more written about how that took place, but it's true. I mean, Chavez, as a historical figure, was created by the church, and he had, you know, by the Democratic Party. You know, and that's why the UFW is an appendage of the Democratic Party, right? But and with the Kennedy family there, I mean, they pushed him into that historical role. They created him. It wasn't his doing. It's nothing that Chavez did that distinguished him historically, right? He had never been involved in a union, never been involved in a strike, never, right? And yet there he was. He was catapulted to become the face of, you know, farm workers. And then, you know, like I said, and I challenge the UFW every single time I see them. Oh, excuse me, on what farms are agricultural workers working today? Who's the farmer that's hiring them? See, they will not look at capitalist, the capitalist economy in the U.S. in agriculture. They will not see that. They will not admit it, because they are not going to take on U.S. capitalism, right? So they keep saying, oh, farm workers. I said, there's no farms here. We're working on plantations nowadays. And we're working, and our employers are corporate bosses that live in San Francisco, in Los Angeles. And who's down here are their labor contractors, okay? But they're not the bosses. The bosses live in the cities, in big corporate headquarters. But the UFW keeps people so ignorant, the workers so ignorant. Oh, no, we're still working on farms. We're still, you know, no, we're working for corporations, U.S. corporations, multinational corporations. And by the way, you know, I remind them, all immigration law is labor law. The reason why they don't want Mexicans right now and other Latinos is because the U.S. is suffering from an excess of labor. You got too much labor here. You got to push it out, keep it out. Because there's, as you know, the last job report, there's more workers than there are jobs. And you got to get rid of too many workers, because they will eventually start to grumble and start to organize and start to rise up, right? So you've got to deflate this right now. And that's what Trump and his fascist friends are trying to do. They need to push out excess labor. They need to stop any more labor coming in.
Okay.
Elazar, could you go ahead and ask your question?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we
can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Mary Jane, thanks for this wonderful personal and intellectual presentation. Number one, just a historical question. Did the United States evolving imperialism promise Aguinaldo, if you help us drive Spain out of the Philippines, we'll grant you independence? Instead, according to Howard Taylor, they murdered up to over 2 million Filipinos, going on for 10 years. That's number one. Number two, you mentioned Howard Taylor, who ended up being the organizer of the Trotskyist Bolshevik tendency. And I was surprised you mentioned him. I do know you knew each other, and that he was a devoted worker and organizer. So any comments about his role in the struggle for organizing labor, I'd be interested. Thank you very much.
You know, Howard was actually Eat Leong's last contact, and he was his contact for the CPUSA. And he would share with me, he'd drive down and see Eat Leong in Delano. And, you know, they talk over party matters and the like. And I said, did you ever ask him, like, what's this alliance with Chavez about? And he said, no, but every time I drove back, you know, I'd always wonder, how long is this going to last? You know, well, it didn't last long because, of course, you know, the powers to be that created Chavez wanted every left leaning, every communist out of, you know, out. And first they gunned for Eat Leong, then they gunned, you know, they just, you know, they made it impossible for Filipinos to stay in the UFW, basically. But one interesting thing is this: when you talk about Marcos going to the Philippines, they had somehow, you know, I mean, I'm sorry, he was already demented at that time, but they convinced him that, you know, there were no Filipinos left in the UFW, basically. I mean, there was a couple, and one of them, oh, gosh, darn, I'm so terrible at names. But actually, I believe he was an agent of the Philippine government, and he's, what was his name? Anyway, he shows up and he said he's there to support his kababayan, right? And I always had suspicions. I said, how does a Philippine businessman show up here in Delano? Well, he was actually the one that paved, you know, with the invitation for Marcos to go and be embraced and greeted by, you know, Marcos, this dictator, right? And so anybody who had any sense of consciousness, I mean, they pretty much left the UFW after that. That, you know, photo went viral, you know, of them embracing each other. But that was basically his whole thing was, you know, well, we're trying to get Filipinos, you know, back into, you know, the UFW and show that we're still blah, blah, blah. But of course it didn't.
Okay, can we let's go with Karen next. Karen Pomerantz, if you would unmute, please. Karen. Let's go ahead to Kit. If you would unmute, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Mary Jane. I wish I'd known you when I lived in Fresno, where I was born and raised. Unfortunately, I grew up in an isolated area of northeast Fresno, where there were no Filipinos there. But my uncle and great uncle were both laborers in the fields, and their living conditions were horrible, just horrible. And I know that there were Filipinos in West Oakland, and life there was just really bad, worse than the poverty-stricken areas of Oakland. So you answered my questions, and thank you very much in terms of clarifying the different roles here. It's taken me a long time to really understand this because I did not grow up with this information. And anyway, are you familiar with Opus Dei? And if so, can you comment on that? Because they are the fascist wing inside the Catholic Church that has taken over the Supreme Court and has a role with J.D. Vance and the executive branch of the current administration.
Let's actually move on. We only have a couple more minutes, and that's a whole new topic, which we could do a program on. Let's get Karen. Let's give her chance since we passed over. Karen, you're unmuted. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much. I was actually texting and couldn't get back, but I was wondering if
you're a little bit hard to. Your microphone is distorting. Can you check your microphone, the up arrow, the mute button? Just make sure you're on the proper mic.
Okay. Is this any better?
Maybe a little closer, but go ahead and ask your question because we're running out of time. Yeah.
Sure, I'll be quick. I wondered if you had heard of Epifano Camacho, who was a communist organizer who opposed Chavez. And they clashed over issues of elections and boycotts and pacifism. against the use of strikes, creating revolution and communism.
I'm sorry, what was the name?
It's not coming through. Maybe you can drop it in the chat.
It's
and
in
then
the chat. It's Epifano Camacho.
Do you know, I think I've heard the name, but mostly in association with KDP, which I was, then during my time in the 70s and the 80s, any revolutionary Filipino, we all belonged to KDP. And I think the Camachos, I mean, they were like, what, 5, 6 Camachos in KDP. He probably was one of the brothers there. But
He was actually
yeah.
from Mexico.
Huh?
He was actually originally from Mexico, but he
Oh,
was very
no,
much opposed to Chavez, and I thought maybe you all had known him.
no, not at all. I'm sorry. I thought because the
Okay.
Camacho name is also very well known. I mean, very widely known in the Philippines. We almost all have Spanish last names. But I just wanted to say, real. No, it's okay. I lost.
Okay. Next, we only have just a few more minutes. Next is Jean, followed by Janet. So Jean, go ahead and unmute.
Okay, I'm unmuted. And thanks so much for this talk. I lived in California most of my life, and I didn't have a clue about the things you were talking about. So great. That's wonderful. I'm also a retired union member and have my dues deducted from my retirement check. So the unions are important. But I notice on the sign behind you, you say unite to form a workers' party. And I'm sure you know that here in California, we do have the Peace and Freedom Party, which is a openly socialist feminist party, anti-imperialist, anti-racist. And I wonder if you have any comments on the Peace and Freedom Party.
I don't, I think I've attended a few of your meetings, but I want to align with anybody who wants to build a workers' party of the Americas, because by the Americas, like I said, Mexicans are very fully integrated into the so-called U.S. labor force, right? So we need to look just like the capitalists. We need to look beyond the national boundaries and not make it only national organizations. I think that when I say workers' party, it has to be very clear the class. When you hear the Republicans and you hear the Democratic speak, they keep talking about the workers. They know that we're the focus. So peace and freedom, no, I'm sorry. We're going for revolution. We are not going for peace. The workers have to take control of this, have to seize power. Okay. Animals are going to continue to become extinct, continue to be brutalized. We're just going war after war. It's endless warfare. Okay. So I'm for a workers' party that clearly says, as opposed to the Republicans, as opposed to the Democrats, we are a class that creates the wealth in this nation. We are workers, and all of us should join on that premise. Now, I know we don't have a communist party, we don't have a vanguard party, but I think with the consciousness of workers, especially in the United States, not in Mexico, but here, you do have to start with a mass organization that at least speaks to them about what is your class. What is the history of this class? What is in the interest of the working class? So that term has to come over and over. We are workers, we are members of the working class, and we are going to take power. And I'm sorry, the peace and freedom does not speak to that. Doesn't.
Okay,
Thank
Janet, last question, Janet, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Alan. And thank you, Mary Jane, for your presentation and your work over all this time. I began to develop politically when I first moved to California from New York City in the late 1980s. That was when I first learned about Cesar Chavez's work. and the Delano grape strike. I went to numerous rallies and marches. I believe they were organized by the Answer Coalition that featured Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta as speakers. Would you talk about the role Answer played in the struggles you've been talking about? And then on a separate but related issue, if time, would you talk about the Filipino community's position on the Gaza genocide?
Well, like any community, we all have our class structure. And so there's no unified, of course, I would say that anyone that has any sense of consciousness and has a concern for people and the events in the world today, side with Gaza. I've met a lot of Filipinos. I went to the rally up in the May 1st, the International Workers' Day, and I ran into quite a number of Filipinos. And the major thing there, of course, is Palestine and the need for a free and to stop the genocide. But as a people here, there's no unified, forthcoming statement in support of the Palestinian people and the call to stop the genocide, right? In terms of the Answer Coalition, I'll tell you, I know nothing about that. I do want to say one thing, though, and that is when I say the U.S. capitalists were very, very clever, the boycott was one of their tactics to undermine the workers' struggle because it diverted the energy and the focus away from militant trade unionizing, away from face-to-face confrontation with the employers, with the bosses. And so strikes were no longer the action to take place. Everything was channeled into the boycott. So the workers lost their role and their power at that point when the boycott became the major, activity for the UFW. Because a boycott, who makes the decision? The workers? No, it's the consumers. They make the decision. The workers, they're on the sidelines already. They're just like, objects to be pitied. And that's what Chavez was about. Oh, pity, pity, it's all that martyr talk. Oh, pity, pity the poor people. No, we're strong and we're militant and we're fighters in this class struggle. That's what we are. Recognize us for what we are. We're not objects for pity.
Well, on that note, a great note, I want to thank you so much for presenting today, Mary Jane. I want to thank everybody for your questions and participation. This is really a great session. It's going to be up on YouTube in a day or so, so you can pass it along. Go to our website at icssmarks.org. You can find a link in a day or so to this video of today's session. You can send it to your friends. Also sign up at our website for future notifications of programs and make a donation if you can. And come back next week when Grover Furr will be speaking on the demise of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. And with that, we're going to end the recording for the program. And again, thank you so much, Mary Jane, for spending time with us. A great program, great talk, and thanks everybody.